I think if we do give approval, we're not going to announce it. You're just going to see things start to explode in Russia, and that would be the smart way to do it. In fact, if I was going to approve such a thing, I would act as though I hadn't approved it and retain the element of surprise.
Hello, and welcome to Independent Thinking, the weekly podcast from Chatham House. I'm James Nixey, the director of the Institute's Russia and Eurasia programme, standing in for Bronwyn, who is away in Israel this week. We are, once again, and unapologetically, discussing Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, now 2 years and almost 7 months in. And, remarkable as it still is to say, Ukraine's incursion into Russia, not yet 2 months in. We'll look at the big story this last week, the West's refusal, well, so far as we know, to approve Ukraine's use of long-range Storm Shadow or Scalp missiles and Attacker missiles to strike targets deep in Russia. I say as far as we know because there are suspicions that something may have been agreed in private. We can get into that. Vladimir Putin, meanwhile, has issued further ominous warnings about what such a green light would mean. On the ground, Ukraine is trying to hold on to the territory it secured inside Russia, captured in its audacious offensive into the Kursk region, which caught the world, and not least the Russians, by surprise. We'll ask whether it's changed the fundamentals of war, and if not, is there anything that can? And in the east of Ukraine, the Russian military is continuing its push in parts of Donbas, leading some, notably in the west, not really in Ukraine or Russia, I have to say, to ask whether the sides are any closer to any form of negotiations. So we'll unpack all of this, and to do so I'm joined by a terrific set of guests. Returning to the podcast and joining us from Kiev is the FT's Ukraine correspondent, Christopher Miller. Welcome back to the podcast, Chris.
It's good to be back. Thank you.
And joining me down the line from Washington is military analyst Michael Kofman, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks for having me on the podcast with.
And finally, joining me in the studio is another familiar voice. Olga Tokariuk is the Open Society University Network Academy Fellow in the Ukraine Forum at Chatham House. Welcome back to the podcast, Olga. Thank you for having me. Okay, let's dive in and into the current state of the battlefield in Ukraine. And perhaps I could start with you, Mike, if that's okay, and really ask you for a sit-rep on the ground, both in Kursk and in Donbas. And of course, we're recording this on Wednesday, the 18th of September, and today there has been what seems to have been quite a significant strike in the Tver region as well.
So the situation looks pretty dynamic to me, and I think it's going to stay this way through the fall heading into the winter. In Kursk, there was a fairly small Russian counterattack over the course of the past week that pushed into the northwestern part of the salient, and Ukrainian forces had crossed the border once again into the Blushkova region by Kursk. So the situation there is actually unfolding and changing on a day-by-day basis. It's not fully clear what Ukraine controls or what Russia might have taken back. But suffice to say that the Kursk pocket had stabilized after the first couple of weeks following the incursion and has now once again become much more, let's say, dynamic, for lack of a better word. Russian forces continue to advance by the Oskil River in the northeastern part of Kharkiv, and the main axis of advance that they have are focused on Chasiv Yar, Toretsk, Pokrovsk. In Pokrovsk, the Russian military has been trying to basically flank around the city, pushing southwest of it and closing up several pockets and salients that have been created. So the real issue is the threat to Ukrainian defensive lines south of Pokrovsk, running away all the way down to Vuhledar, past Kurakhova. You have the Russian military currently fighting and I think likely taking the town of Ukrainsk and trying to push into another town called Sedudovo. So essentially, they're trying to wrap southwest around Pokrovsk. They're already well within artillery range of the city, so the city's military utility has, I think, declined significantly at this point. But there, you see Russian and Ukrainian forces setting up for likely will be the siege. And I suspect in the next couple of months, what we will see unfolding is the siege of Pokrovsk. Sadly, as we've seen with several other cities over the course of this war, Russian and Ukrainian forces right now are contesting Toretsk, but the Russian military continues to make steady advances there. So the way I would summarize the situation at the front is the Kursk incursion had forced the Russian military to shift some units from the front and from within Russia. It has not led to a wholesale shift or loss of momentum amongst Russian forces. Probably on the contrary, to some extent, the Russian offensive had accelerated over the course of August and September, particularly in Donetsk. Things seem to have stabilized a bit around Pokrovsk at least about 2 weeks ago, but it's not easy to tell whether that's because Ukraine laterally moved several brigades to reinforce the Pokrovsk salient, which they did, or if it's because Russian forces had begun to focus further south and southwest, and that's been the main area where they've been trying to advance. I'll just be frank that it's a bit unclear. Ukraine has had, I would say, significantly increased success with larger scale drone strikes in Russia, targeting Russian logistics, critical infrastructure, air bases. The one most recently in the last day, as you mentioned, that's probably the largest ammunition dump strike that I have seen. It's a fairly sizable ammunition storage depot that they hit. So to me, that those kind of strikes have become more and more successful on the Ukrainian side and increasingly inflicted damage to Russian infrastructure. We'll see if that has an effect in slowing down the Russian offensive campaign. Chris, being on the ground right now, certainly much more recently than I have, could have some good insights regarding the situation in Donetsk and what's happening.
Well, thanks for that. It's a good way of starting off. And I was indeed going to come to Chris and Olga for the same question, really, sticking with the Kursk offensive, perhaps, though. How impactful, both in military and in psychological terms, do you feel it has been? I mean, Olga, why don't you go first?
As Michael said, probably one of Ukraine's objectives to prompt Russia to withdraw some of its units from Pokrovsk direction. It didn't happen, so it didn't materialize. But indeed, what the successes of this operation are already, well, definitely switching again, the attention to Ukraine being able to have an initiative in the war, to make some asymmetric moves, to make some unexpected, surprising attacks and incursions, grabbing, the headlines again of the world media and boosting that morale both inside the country but also among Ukraine's partners, that Ukraine is capable of fighting Russia, that Russia is not as strong as it pretends to be, that Russia is not able to respond, pushing those red lines that, are so much feared of, especially by Ukraine's Western partners, that violating Russia's border would mean an immediate nuclear response from Putin, so that didn't happen. Another thing which is a major achievement, and I think many Ukrainians would agree with that, is that Ukraine, in the course of this Kursk offensive, which is still underway, right, with its outcome unclear, and it remains still a risky bet, but Ukraine managed to take hundreds of Russian prisoners of war, notably conscripts, and it turned out that these people are important for Russia, that Russia immediately started negotiations with Ukrainians for prisoners exchanges, for POW exchanges, and several such exchanges have already happened. So hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers, but also civilians that have been held by Russia since 2022, and even earlier returned to Ukraine in recent weeks since the Kursk operation began.
Yeah, thanks, Olga. I absolutely agree. I think the taking of Russian prisoners is significant and a real booster. I'm less convinced by the idea, some have mentioned, that it's a useful bargaining chip in negotiations later on, but we can get to that. So, Chris, in Kiev, tell me how it looks there. Are we still in that sort of honeymoon period? Obviously, there was initial euphoria, but that has died down. But where are we now?
I think the honeymoon period is over. I think because the situation in Kursk remains dynamic, as Mike said, a lot of Ukrainians and Western correspondents and observers are still obviously watching closely to see what transpires there. I'll zoom in on the Donetsk region since I just spent all of last week there. I think the initial euphoria you mentioned around the Kursk operation, that certainly boosted morale countrywide here, for sure. And certainly among many of the soldiers who I think were really in need of a boost after losing the initiative to Russia on the battlefield last year and really facing this creeping Russian advance over the course of much of this year. The situation in the East, I would say, though, right now is extremely difficult. I wouldn't say it's dire. The front line is not collapsing, but to use a word that Mike and I have used in discussions with each other, the Russians have breached Ukrainian defenses there. I met with commanders and soldiers of 4 brigades. All of them said that they face several challenges that are presenting them with this increasingly difficult situation. One is that the situation generally has not changed. Russia is bigger. They have more resources, more manpower, bigger weapons. They're utilizing things like these devastating glide bombs and just pulverizing Ukrainian positions and cities and towns. So, nobody is under any illusions that Pokrovsk is going to survive Russian attacks. They're trying to hold their ground there, the Ukrainians, but every commander I spoke to said, unfortunately, Pokrovsk in the next coming months will probably end up looking like Marinka, Bakhmut, all of these cities in eastern Ukraine that were completely destroyed by Russian shelling and bombs. They also face their own challenges in terms of ammunition shortages. The ratio of shells still is not in Ukraine's favor. They're not even close to parity there. Even with Western shipments, in terms of manpower, they have one soldier to maybe 10 of the Russians. They are facing these new tactics that Russia is employing and having success with, which are these really small mobile infantry units that are storming toward Ukrainian trenches in old Lada cars with the doors torn off for quick exits, and all these motorbikes and dune buggies. They're really hard to stop, even with the reconnaissance drones allowing the Ukrainians to see what the Russians are doing, with the FPV drones that allow them to target pieces of armor and other units. These mobile forces, which a lot of the commanders described as employing tactics that were utilized by Wagner in Bakhmut in 2023, are allowing the Russians to steadily advance forward. Now, I know there's been a lot of discussion about the line slowing down or solidifying some around Pokrovsk, but we just saw the city of Hrodivka, or the town of Hrodivka, taken, almost all of it, except for maybe a small little district in the north over the past couple of days. Further south of Pokrovsk, near Korakova, Vuhledar, the Russians are having greater success in encircling some of these, or forming these cauldrons around several strategic little areas that would allow them to apply more pressure on the remainder of that southern area of Donetsk Oblast and Pokrovsk. I heard a lot of complaints from commanders about the lack of strong fortifications. I saw a lot of new fortifications and trenches being really hastily built in the area, but the commanders there told me, the Russians have had success here because we failed, the military leadership failed to erect strong defenses at the start of the full-scale invasion, and especially after the Russian capture of Avdiivka in February. So they're facing a slew of issues, including many that I didn't name, but I'll stop after I just mention one more, and that is the poor training of newly mobilized soldiers. So there's been this big mobilization drive since the new laws were signed by President Zelensky in the spring. The Ukrainians are now able to conscript upwards of 30,000 new troops every month. But those new troops are not getting adequate training. Every commander I spoke to regretfully said these guys, when they get to us, are unprepared. They're terrified. They've maybe fired 10 or 11 live rounds during training, and they're just not fit for service. The average age of soldiers now is 45 plus, and they're just not able to compete with better experienced, better equipped Russian soldiers. And so you've got this, situation where the Ukrainian ranks are older. The more experienced troops have been killed or wounded in battle, or more recently rotated north to Kursk. And the lines in Donetsk region are probably as weak as they've been since the start of the full-scale invasion.
Thank you very much indeed, Chris. That's deeply disturbing, but vital information. Mike, can I return to you? And can we get back into the issue of long-range missiles and what happened last week? First of all, can you just maybe let us know a little bit about what Storm Shadows and Scalps will bring to this war? Can they make a difference? And secondly, perhaps since you're in Washington with your Washington hat on, what do you think is the reason that the US didn't give approval, or at least not open approval, or perhaps you think tacitly that they have?
Well, first, I should be upfront about the fact that I don't know. I think if we do give approval, we're not going to announce it. You're just going to see things start to explode in Russia, and that would be the smart way to do it. In fact, if I was going to approve such a thing, I would act as though I hadn't approved it, right? And have retained the element of surprise, because capabilities like this tend to be the most effective when they're really first introduced on the battlefield at scale, right? Then they drive a degree of adaptation, counter development, what have you. So you want to maximize the initial impact for when they're first introduced. I am a bit frustrated watching U.S.-British talks and the kind of publicity of it and the slow walking of the decision, and seeing months ago Russia had already moved tactical aviation from air bases that are within range of these capabilities. They have basically sorted out the Black Sea Fleet from Novorossiysk as well in the last couple of days in potential anticipation of such strikes. So this is unfortunately giving them quite a bit of time and notice far more than you'd like to see. My general sense regarding the decision, of course, is I don't know if it will be made, and if it will be made fully or partially, in the sense that U.S. will agree to Britain employing Storm Shadow missiles, for example, rather than U.S. and UK and France altogether employing the capabilities. I'm much more excited about the potential of U.S. Making a decision on JASM and introducing that as well, because it is in some way better penetrating capability, and we might be able to supply far more of them down the line than the Brits and the French. Sorry, not to be the, sort of stereotypical American guy more excited about American capabilities than British. Sorry, James. Regarding the decision overall, so here's my view of it. I see concrete tasks that this can achieve, right? You can employ these capabilities to inflict significant damage to Russian logistics, which could really slow down Russian momentum, force a reorganization period, and buy Ukraine potentially much needed time for a period of months during this difficult time in the war. You could inflict damage against Russian critical infrastructure such that it eventually forces Russia into some kind of deal to halt critical infrastructure strikes. And I think that would be of immense benefit to Ukraine. You could see these capabilities as being used discreetly to target Russian air defense. And the value of that would be is it would then substantially open up the space for Ukrainian-owned drone strikes, right? That is, it would maximize the impact and effect of Ukraine's own capabilities, which are growing both in quantity and quality. So there's different things this could accomplish. Do I think that this is going to be a war-winning, game-changing weapon? No, but that's been my view of literally every single weapon we've introduced. And I've been trying to convince people for 2.5 years not to think this way about a conventional war, manage their expectations, and instead think of it as something that is part of a broader strategy, right? That it can help as part of a bigger strategy, both military, political, economic, what have you. And then the last point I make is, look, Kursk did reveal something important, James, which is that the United States and other countries in Ukraine are not really on the same page strategy-wise. And it prompted a conversation that I think we've seen unfold over the last couple of weeks. I hope that the result of that conversation will be strategic alignment on the way forward in this war. I hope that that's what all the shuttle diplomacy is about. That's not just about long-range strike, okay? Because if we're just talking about long-range strike, then we're not talking about strategy. We're talking about a piece of it, right? And then a better vision emerges from this, and it's to some extent used as an opportunity. So generally, I've been supportive of it, but also understanding that it depends on what we actually provide. Right? Do we provide these capabilities in substantial number and scale rather than just changing policy on restrictions? And it depends how they are used, and it depends how that's paired with a broader approach. And yes, the issue is more complex than just being a matter of permissions as well from a technical perspective. So that's where I'll leave it. I think it's been an important conversation. I think it's sort of the last threshold we have to cross. We've used these capabilities in Crimea. We've allowed Ukraine to conduct HIMARS strikes in Belgorod and in Kursk, sort of in Russia. And so now I think it's a very interesting debate because I see us sort of holding on a fairly, I don't like to use the word arbitrary, but I've used it in public, so why not? Fairly arbitrary threshold at this point, in terms of where we are. It's a real question. Why are we holding there? But I'm not privy to all the internal discussions, so I'll leave it there.
Well, anyway, I take your point. There's few game changers in this war, if any, and it's more about cumulative effects. Thanks for that. Olga, just returning to you and maybe to more domestic matters in a sense. There's been a big upheaval in Zelensky's cabinet in the last few weeks. How is this impacting the war effort in your view?
Well, yeah, on surface, or if you just read the news, it seems that many things have changed. So many ministers have been dismissed or replaced, and so many, new or not so new faces have entered the government. But in fact, these faces are not exactly new. So some of the ministers who have been dismissed were actually promoted to other positions. So they remained in the government or they started to work in the president's office, and also vice versa. So, for example, a new foreign minister, Andriy Sybiha, is someone who was previously working in the office of the president, very close to Andriy Yermak, who is chief of staff of Zelensky cabinet of the presidential office. He is now the Minister of Foreign Affairs, replacing Dmytro Kuleba, who was serving for 5 years, one of the longest serving ministers in this government, along with the Justice Minister Denis Maluska, who also was rumored to have been requesting a relief from these duties for a long time, and finally he was allowed to leave the government, and there is a new Minister of Justice now. That does not mean that there is much change for Ukrainian politics, though. Obviously, Ukraine is not able to hold the elections under the martial law. It is impossible to organize and guarantee the safety and security of the elections. There were no elections in Ukraine for the last 5 years, since 2019, when the last time presidential and parliamentary elections took place. So what these changes mean, basically, they just solidify Zelensky in power, solidify his power, the power of his party. They are not changing very much on the political scene. They are rather increasing the role of the presidential office in the government. So they remove that very fragile independence or balance of power that there was, and they rather strengthen Zelensky and Yermak as people who are actually making the decisions and who are making appointments also based on some personal loyalty rather than on accomplishments. And it is also important what didn't happen, like what changes didn't happen. So, for example, the Minister of Energy, Halushenko, who has attracted so much criticism from the Ukrainian civil society and, was accused also of facilitating some corruption schemes, of not handling efficiently, not preparing the country to Russian attacks on the energy infrastructure, not to kind of mitigating their impact efficiently. So he remained in power, he remained in place. So I don't think this, changes will have a huge impact, as I said, on the political scene, but also on the war effort. Rather, they would just increase the influence and the impact of President Zelensky and Andriy Yermak, who's basically his grey cardinal, if we can say like that.
No, we can say that, and that is also a little bit disquieting in a different sense. Talking of civil society, Chris, again, being as you're in Kiev, you mentioned a little bit about mobilization in your previous remarks, but do you think that Ukrainian civil society would accept a mobilization of younger adults? I know there's been really quite fierce debates. People have lost their jobs as a result on conscription ages. What do you think is acceptable to the majority of Ukrainian youth, I suppose, in civil society?
That is a really difficult question to answer, whether or not society is ready for that or will accept it. There are commanders with whom I've spoken recently, including last week around the front lines in the East. There are military people within the defense ministry here who I've spoken to. There are politicians in parliament, and there are even members of Zelensky's government and administration who I've spoken to who all say, of course, we need to lower the age of conscription here. And they point to, some of the most powerful countries in the world in the age of either mobilization or recruitment as a sign of a healthy, powerful military, right? The average age, as I mentioned earlier now, of an active duty combat soldier in Ukraine is 45 plus. It's not getting younger, right? The army is getting older. So they do need to do something about that. Now, obviously, this is a political decision that needs to be made. Zelensky spent a year debating whether or not he would lower the age of conscription from 27 to 25. I do think that there could come a time where another difficult decision on this is going to need to be made. A lot of people have told me they think that the longer this goes on, the closer we will get to that kind of decision. I think certainly there are political reasons why Zelensky doesn't want to make that decision right now. It's a deeply unpopular decision. Anecdotally, I can say that all of the young men who I know here, by young I mean by Ukrainian military standards, so let's say under the age of 40, but especially men under the age of 30, are not highly motivated at the moment to join. Those who have already joined the military, they remain motivated. They know what's at stake and they're very, very motivated to fight. But those who did not run to ammunition depots to pick up a rifle in February or March of 2022 are laying low, or looking for a way out of mobilization.
Or of Ukraine.
And hoping that they don't have to join the fight. Right. Or they're doing something else to volunteer their time and service in another way by fundraising or something along those lines in hopes of not drawing the attention of a military recruiter to be sent to the front lines. So this is all to say that there are certainly people here who view it as a necessary step if Ukraine wants to turn things around on the battlefield, or really just to replenish their brigades that are losing, their more experienced fighters every day. But it's going to be an extremely difficult decision to be made.
I'll go back to you, and maybe for the rest of this discussion, what remains of it. I mean, let's go from the present to a future. And I'm always a little bit leery of asking about ceasefires and negotiations. But what's your view on this? I mean, is the situation in Donbas going to get so difficult at some point that they'll have to? Where's the threshold, the breaking point? I'm nervous about it because the Ukrainians and the Russians, actually, for that matter, they're not talking about it. It more happens in the West. So where do you come down on it?
If we look at the kind of public opinion surveys of Ukrainians, we will see that only about a third of Ukrainians are ready to talk about some sort of negotiations or are ready, for Ukraine to start considering it. So it's still a minority. Yes, this number has grew compared to the beginning of the full-scale invasion when it was just about 7 or 8%, so 30% is more significant, it might seem. But so much depends on whether there is any possibility for Ukraine to get some sort of security guarantees, and President Zelensky was mentioning and is still mentioning that NATO is the only viable security guarantee for Ukraine because there is no trust absolutely in Ukraine that Russia will respect any sort of an agreement. Similarly to what happened since 2014 when 2 Minsk agreements were signed and violated by Russia. So there is no trust in Ukraine that even if there are some sort of negotiations, if some sort of a deal is signed with Russia, that Russia will stick to that. The predominant view that Russia will just use this time to regroup, rearm, and attack Ukraine again. So unless there is a strong security guarantee for Ukraine, like NATO membership, I think this will not be taken into consideration seriously. Then another thing is whether Ukraine is being actually pressured into some sort of negotiations by Western countries the Americans who are saying, look, if Trump comes to power, you will not get any assistance. And there was a Trump recorded message to the participants of the YES conference in Kyiv just a few days ago that conveyed that very well, that Trump is somehow sure that he's going to stop the war, but that looks like he will basically force Ukraine to surrender. So I think there is anxiety in Ukraine, in Kyiv, because of this pressure, because of the uncertainty of the outcome of the US elections, because of the fact that also European countries do not seem very keen on even, delivering on the promises that have been already made to Ukraine, like 1,000 artillery shells that were supposed to arrive to Ukraine earlier this year. They are still not there. And even Poland is not holding up to its obligations on this project. Not to mention, Germany cutting the military aid assistance to Ukraine budget for the next year. So I think there is a lot of anxiety in Ukraine over the extent of this Western support. There is an effort to make Ukraine more independent or just partially self-reliant so that it can strike even targets inside Russia with its own drones. That's what it's been doing. That's what it continues to do. But of course, there is an understanding that Ukraine's capabilities will not be enough in the near future to inflict, serious damage on Russia if the Western support is not at least maintained at the same level, but in the best case scenario increased.
For what it's worth, Olga, I know some quite serious Russia analysts who think that Vladimir Putin would prefer a Harris presidency on the basis that Trump is so unpredictable it wouldn't be good for Russia. And in fact, Trump could be persuaded that he could be a great victor if he were to do more than the Biden administration has done. I'm not sure I buy that argument, but
I think it's wishful thinking.
Yeah,
but...
sure. Actually, sticking with Washington and Mike, I will take you back to the front line in a second, but I do want to keep you with your Washington hat on for a second. I mean, Zelensky is due to meet Biden this month. He'll present a plan for ending the war. We've heard some rumours. Sullivan said a little bit about it, but do you know much about this plan? What more do we know?
My understanding is that some combination of existing Ukrainian initiatives, such as the Peace Summit, which I'm not really sure have gone anywhere, but there will be increased economic pressure on Russia via sanctions and export controls. The belief that greater diplomatic pressures amongst other countries in power, such as China, India, and Saudi Arabia, can be brought to bear, and I don't think I've really seen that, but nonetheless, it's out there. A combination of increased military assistance, long-range strikes, in Russia as well, which is essentially increasing the cost on Russia and having a compelling effect on the Russian ability to stay in the war. This is just my own hypothesis. I'll be frank, I don't know what it will look like. But here's the truth. In conversations with folks, a lot of people have been dealing with this war for the last 2.5 years. So the view to some extent is, well, what could it be? There isn't some unobtainium out there that folks have not thought of yet in terms of how the war could be won. I think we remain overall on a path where we're trying to sort out how to achieve war termination for Ukraine on favorable terms. What does that look like at this point? What will be the leverage necessary to achieve this war termination? Part of it is clearly military. A big part of it is military. Other components are diplomatic, economic, what have you. And for Ukraine, the plan is important because it helps drive a conversation on resource and external support. And I won't be surprised if Ukraine will be looking to see what are its prospects for another supplemental in U.S. Congress. That's what a lot of this does have to do with. And for us, it's also important to, I think, understand what was Ukraine looking for in material and economic financial assistance, right? What are the expectations? But there's a big challenge, and the challenge is very straightforward. I'll close on this, James. We have an election coming up in November. The administration is going to change. A lot of the folks in this administration, no matter what happens in the election, will be gone. They'll be gone in a matter of months. Okay, these are the rules. And so it's very difficult to get agreement on a new strategy or have bold changes in strategy when a lot of people involved are not going to be there the next couple of months, and they're all looking to what is the next thing they're going to be doing. I just want to be frank, right? To some extent, people are policy, and you ask for a Washington, D.C. perspective, and so I have to convey that reality. That on the one hand, Ukraine doesn't have time, and there's a sense that the war is not sustainable. But on the other hand, Washington right now is very far from being in the best place to discuss a new strategy or plan.
That does make sense. Thank you very much indeed. Chris, maybe a last word from you. I mean, is there potential for Ukraine to conduct another large-scale offensive, or has that sort of been beaten out of them for the time being? You presented a fairly dark picture, so maybe not, especially as offensives haven't gone as well as defensives by and large in this war so far. What have they got left in them?
Well, yeah, sorry to present so much doom and gloom. I would argue that this is realism. My conversations with the commanders on the front line in the East were much more realistic than I think they had been over the past couple of years. I think in terms of an offensive, certainly in various sectors, there are different missions at hand right now. I mean, like in the Donbas, it is to hold the line, to stop the Russian advance. And nobody there is thinking of an offensive. They're thinking about stronger defensive positions, stronger fortifications, just halting Russia's forward movement. We are seeing still, an offensive up north in Kursk. And Mike said that this is still a dynamic situation. That has not fully solidified and stalled, right? So the Ukrainians are still entering Russia from Ukrainian territory in a couple of places. That shows that there is still some potential there, but these are not large-scale offensives, and this is also an offensive that isn't happening inside of Ukraine, right? So one could argue about the strategy behind it, and as Olga pointed out earlier, part of that was to draw forces away from these hotspots in eastern Ukraine in hopes of alleviating these exhausted forces in the Donetsk region. So there are things that Ukraine is trying and is able to do asymmetrically. I think the big question is whether or not they are going to influence the battlefield and the war longer term and help to get Ukraine into what would be a stronger position from which it could negotiate when both armies are maybe inevitably sometime down the road exhausted and need to start formulating some kind of end to this.
Yeah, whether the battlefield can influence the politics, absolutely. Mike, last word from you, if I may, really last word. I mean, just how you think this might develop into next year, whether Russia can maintain its enormous losses without mobilization perhaps in 2025. I think I've seen you say or write that Russians do have a plausible theory of victory into 2026. Can you take us into the future as far as Russia is concerned, please?
Oh, what an easy question. Let's see if I could wrap up my crystal ball gazing here. So here's my view of it. I think that Russia's operating under some fairly significant limitations in terms of equipment availability and manpower as well at the rate that they're trying to sustain offensive operations. A lot obviously depends on how this fall and winter is going to go. There is a prospect that Ukraine is going to steadily exhaust Russia's offensive potential. We just don't know what it will cost and how much territory Ukraine will have to give up to do that. Russia's relative advantage on the front line is likely to decline next year. That's my base assumption. Assuming Ukraine stabilizes its manpower situation, which it might be on track to do this winter, fortifications. Wherever the line stabilizes at some point, it will enable Ukraine to perhaps fortify there. And it could expand the strike campaign against Russian territory. Of course, a lot hinges on the material support that Ukraine can get as well from the West, and we don't quite know what that's going to look like. Another big factor, what's going to happen this winter with Ukraine's power grid, electricity, the economy, to what extent people will leave the country. I don't know. I plan to, as always, come at some point in the fall myself and the latter part in the winter, but I don't know what the impact will be. So that's a big question mark. I think that following the Kursk offensive, we have a somewhat larger cone of uncertainty in terms of how the situation could unfold in the next 6 months, right? There's some both bigger ups and some bigger downs when I look at it compared to the way I saw the situation unfolding in July. I think, of course, both sides' assessments of their prospects are going to be shaped by, to some extent, by the U.S. election. Not everything hinges on that, but it's an important factor, especially if you're talking about prospects for negotiations, how Russia perceives Ukraine's hand going into 2025, right? What assistance Ukraine can expect and vice versa. So that's another big factor, the answer to which we really don't know. If we said we knew lots of things prior to the Kursk offensive, which we didn't anticipate, then we would have been wrong on a number of them too. So it's always good to have a bit of humility in that score, right? We don't know the events that haven't happened yet. And so we shouldn't project a false confidence onto a large-scale conventional war in Europe and say, we definitely know how things are going to look 6 months from now.
That's absolutely right. And we absolutely appreciate the realist view that you and Chris have offered. And that doesn't change what ought to happen, but it's possibly a very different thing as to what might happen. And of course, that is really still unknowable. Thank you very much. That is the show. Enormous gratitude to my guests, Michael Kofman, Christopher Miller, and of course, Olga Tokariuk. Follow them all on Twitter or X if you prefer, where you can also find Chatham House, of course, which is also on Blue Sky. All the details are in the show notes. And as a reminder, you can listen to all the episodes of Independent Thinking on Apple, Spotify, or all major podcast platforms, as well as through our social media channels. Please like, follow, and subscribe. So, with busy weeks ahead, both internationally and domestically, it's goodbye from me, James Nixey. It's great to step in, but Bronwyn is back next week.